Good evening and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Bishop Lainie Peterson and I'm joined tonight by our producer, Brother Jonathan, and we have a very special guest this evening, Dr. Dylan Burns, who is a Gnostic scholar, and in fact he is the author of this amazing new book called The Apocalypse of the Alien God. This was my birthday present to myself, and in fact before the show I was thanking him for writing the book and giving me such a great birthday present. So welcome, Dr. Burns.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. So we're just going to start in here. Who were the Sethians? Who were the Sethian Gnostics?
This is unfortunately a much more complicated question than it has to be. But the short answer would be that we have two ancient testimonies about groups that call themselves Sethians. One from a 3rd century church father named Hippolytus, who was in Rome, and a scholar writing around the turn of the 5th century named Epiphanius of Salamis. Neither of the individuals that they describe as Sethians seem to have much to do, as far as we can tell, theologically or sociologically, with the group of texts that scholars today call Sethian Gnostic literature. This latter group of texts is a group of documents discovered at Nag Hammadi, which is in Upper Egypt, in 1945. Text probably written in Greek and preserved in Coptic, the later language of Roman and medieval Egypt. And in the 1970s, a German scholar named Hans Martin Schenke recognized that a subgroup of these texts from Nag Hammadi seemed to share a kind of mythological system.
Okay.
Various kinds of deities and angels, baptismal language, baptismal traditions, and especially veneration of the figure of Seth, the 3rd child of Adam and Eve, the good one,
Right.
as revealer and savior. And because of this focus on Seth, he called this literature Sethian Gnostic literature. Now, no Sethian text says this was written by the Sethians. Right. Or the Sethians. And so, as you may note as you read my book, I try not to talk about the Sethians or the Sethian Gnostics, actually, because we don't have any evidence for Sethians who read Sethian literature. Rather, we have this particular body of texts that scholars might say preserve Sethian traditions in the same way that we talk about apocalyptic traditions, even though we don't talk about the apocalypticists as a social group.
Right.
This is an important distinction because scholarship in the 70s to the 90s or so did talk about Sethians, assuming that there must have been a concrete social group that called themselves Sethians that produced this literature about the figure of Seth. But that's actually an assumption that I'm not so sure we should make. However, we do know that there were particular groups of people bringing this sort of literature together and discussing it, and we can locate these people at a particular place and time. Whether or not we want to call them Sethians is a technical question. It wouldn't be unreasonable to do so, but I don't do it in my book. One group, of course, are the people who put together the Nag Hammadi text in the first place. They obviously knew all this Sethian literature and bound it together along with a lot of other texts, Valentinian texts, liturgical texts, and so forth. The Gospel of Thomas, for example. And on the other hand, and this is where the story gets very interesting, a 3rd century philosopher named Porphyry, writing probably at the end of the 3rd century, but about a period of his time, of his life, where he was in Rome in the 260s CE, studying with another great philosopher named Plotinus, very famous for influencing St. Augustine, says that in around 263 or so, there were some Christians who were involved with our group. They were heretics. They said that they had other authorities, so they trusted on metaphysical matters more than Plato. This is a Platonic group. And they read books with the names like this, Zostrianos, Autogenes, Nicotheos, and so forth. The names of some of these texts are the same as names of some of the texts we have from Nag Hammadi. And then when we compare what Porphyry, who says that his master Plotinus wrote a book against these people, and what Plotinus says about the books that these people had, when we compare that with some of the Nag Hammadi material, which has the same titles as the books that Porphyry mentions, we see that it's obviously some kind of version of the same literature. So we know that this literature that scholars today like to call Sethian Gnostic was circulating in a philosopher's circle in around 263 CE. And this allows us to be able to say, okay, some of this very intense Gnostic apocalyptic tradition was actually being discussed by Greek philosophers and by people who knew about Greek philosophy in Rome in around 263. And that tells us that that gives us a window into diagnosing the socio-cultural background of a particular group of Gnostics. This is important because we have next to no other information about Gnostics from a socio-historical angle. The Church Fathers don't tell us a lot about what Gnostics were like, except that they were Christians and in their congregations. But philosophers' reading groups were a much more particular, concrete setting. Not a lot of people were rich enough and well-connected enough to even make it to such a group. So this tells us that these Gnostics were very well educated, they're politically connected. Plotinus' circle often met in the palaces of the emperor in Rome itself. Absolutely. They're, in order to be reading this difficult Greek philosophical literature, they must have achieved something like a postgraduate education today, working on Greek philosophy. So, but at the same time, they were very suspicious of the authoritative traditions of Greek education, which is to say, Greek historians, Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and so forth. They wanted to invoke the authorities of sages like Zostrianos and Autogenes with very Jewish-sounding names and revelatory texts that had very Jewish themes and motifs that would have been persuasive in a Jewish or Christian environment. That's really an interesting thing.
That is an interesting thing, because one of the things I know had been discussed before the show was that at one point it was people were trying to place Gnosticism in pagan communities, but that's
right.
changing. That's changing.
Absolutely. That's a great question. The particular texts that we know to have circulated in Plotinus' circle do not mention Jesus Christ as the Savior. They don't talk about Jesus of Nazareth. And so when they were initially discovered and translated, the scholars working on them said, well, they must be pagan, because we know that they were in a pagan philosophical group and they don't talk about Jesus or quote the New Testament. It's got to be that simple, right?
Right.
Well, not really, actually, because the sort of myths that these stories contain and the way that they communicate the knowledge that they want to pass on to the reader are done in the idiom and tone of what scholars today call late antique apocalyptic literature or Hellenistic apocalyptic literature. These are texts like First Enoch or Second Enoch, pseudepigraphic literature, which uses the technique of pseudepigraphy, which is writing a text and then assigning the name of somebody who's very authoritative within a particular social group, like Enoch or Abraham or Moses, what have you, in order to assert a lot of authority over what is being communicated. There are other aspects of these texts that are nothing like what you find in contemporary Greek intellectual life, but Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature. For example, the texts themselves are apocalypses, which means revelations, texts that are communicated from heaven to a particular seer or prophet by some kind of intermediary, usually an angel. These angels are grumpy, and the seers or prophets are upset. There's a lot of emotional Sturm und Drang that drives these people to obtain their revelations. And there are particular idioms and niceties you find in this text. For example, these seers, they like to ride on clouds. The journey to heaven is described as a scary place. They're intimidated. They need to be reassured once in a while. All of this is very common in the Jewish pseudepigraphic literature of the period, and very strange in the Greek philosophical context. So what we see then is that these Gnostic apocalypses that were in Plotinus' circle, and I argue in my book, the majority of the Sethian literature itself seems to come from a place that's not exactly Christian or Jewish, but from groups that are between them, from the borderlines between our modern sense of Judaism and Christianity. And this actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. There were lots of biblically informed or Abrahamic groups, as it were, in Syria, the Middle East, in Rome, that did not necessarily belong to the ancient Catholic Church or identify Jesus of Nazareth as the chief savior and prophet, but on the other hand, were not easily assimilatable to Greco-Roman religion either. So the authors of the Sethian texts, whether or not we choose to call them Sethians, were people from one of these groups. And we know that they had a very strong interest in baptism. There's a lot of baptismal language in this literature. And yet there also is some anti-baptismal polemic. Some of these texts argue that the true baptism is not of water, but it's of light, it's of spirit.
Okay.
And we know that there were a lot of baptismal groups in Mesopotamia and especially Syria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, from attestations from other church fathers of the period. And one anti-baptismal thinker who grew up in such a baptismal group was Mani, the founder of the religion known as Manichaeism, arguably the first world religion. And due to these and due to the similarity to Mani and his thought with respect to baptismal thought, conjoined to anti-baptismal polemic, and then other aspects of Sethian texts that are actually quite particular and uncommon, such as, for example, affirmation of the belief in reincarnation of souls. Not a lot of Judeo-Christian groups affirmed that at the time.
Right.
Due to these and other shared characteristics with Manichaeism, I think that the Sethian literature probably comes from some kind of baptismal milieu in Syria or Mesopotamia in the 3rd century. We have a link to Rome because Hippolytus, who I mentioned earlier, knew of some kind of Sethian group in Rome at the time, says that a missionary from one of these Mesopotamian Baptist groups, the Alchacites, came to Rome, a man named Alcibiades, and he brought books with him. And I wonder if perhaps it's this Alcibiades who transmitted these Sethian traditions to Rome, which is how they would have come into the hands of the Christian heretics known to Porphyry, who he called Gnostics.
Okay. Thank you for that. It's fascinating. Now, one thing that I have to say, you're talking about these Gnostics as being seriously educated people, postgraduate education, all that. Now, not so long ago, a scholar, Larry Hurtado, said that the Gnostics were not intellectuals. And he kind of, and that kind of caused a bit of a kerfuffle. What would he basically said they were kind of elitist, they weren't trying to defend their opinions in public, that sort of thing. What you're describing sounds a little different than that.
I think Professor Hurtado was not thinking about the people in Porphyry's circle. And I remember visiting his blog and looking at the comments section. Somebody brought up the Gnostics and Plotinus' circle, and he had to say, well, obviously these are very educated people. My guess is that what he was going for was saying that Gnostic literature as we possess it is largely revelatory. It relies on the authority of revelation.
Yeah, it does.
These texts don't really make philosophical arguments. They tell you how it is, and they do it by telling a story that may or really hit you hard or leave you cold. That's what apocalypses do. It's a particular genre. It's a literary form, and in this sense, it is not very philosophical because this is not how investigation works in the Greek philosophical tradition, which relies on logos, rationality, demonstration, which to a very large extent defines for us philosophy today. So there's also an interesting extent to which we can talk very generally about the relationship between revelatory thought or apocalypticism versus philosophy in general, and looking at the Plotinus Gnostic conflict, Greek philosophy versus revelatory literature. And I think that's what Hurtado was going for. But to say that Gnostics were not educated people was, of course, a misjudgment, and that is refuted by the historical evidence.
Yeah. Okay.
When we talk about the revelation and the importance of it in these groups' texts, Were they trying to duplicate what was in the text and experience it for themselves? Are these experiences that people actually had? Were they trying to ascend and have these apocalyptic experiences for themselves, would you say?
It's a difficult question because all we have are the textual artifacts. We don't have any, how to put it, magical diaries by Gnostics that say, well, I was trying out the apocalypse of Zostrianos after fasting for 3 days and spinning around in circles, and then I saw some angels. Instead, we have the texts that purport to be experiences of an ancient seer having these ascents. Of course, there's an endless scholarly debate going on about whether these texts testify to experiences or what scholars call literary cliché, whether the claim to have an experience is simply a way of asserting authority for what one is trying to communicate. There are arguments to be made for both perspectives. However, one of these texts, a very interesting liturgical text from Nag Hammadi, and Nag Hammadi Codex 7, it's called the Three Steles of Seth. It says, we see, we see, we see, we bless you, we glorify you, we have been saved. This first person plural language leads me to think that it's meant to be recited in a group, and that means we have a concrete social setting, probably for people who believed that in performing these liturgies, they attained some kind of similarity to angelic beings and were uplifted and attained, at least for a temporary period, a kind of semi-divine state, as it were. Why else would you have a first-person plural in such a text?
That would seem to be the case, yes. Well, unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap this up right now. Thank you so much, Dr. Burns, for coming on the show. This is absolutely fascinating, and really appreciate your taking the time to do this for us on a Sunday, too. So thank you so much.
For having me.
Now, I want to ask our audience, do you identify with the Sethian mythology? And if so, do you put it into practice? If you do, we'd like to hear about it. You can certainly leave a comment in YouTube, or you can go to our Facebook page and leave a comment there. We'd love to start a discussion with you on this topic. Also, we want to let everybody know that coming up on Talk Gnosis, Frater Ashen Chasen will be on our show, and we'll be discussing working with angels. Frater Ashen Chasen is an amazing ceremonial magician and an author. He's got a great book out, and I'm really looking forward to this particular show. So if you're interested in working with angels, this is the man who can tell you about how to do it. So, again, thank you, Dr. Byrne, for being on our show, and thank you, Brother Jonathan, for sitting in this time for Bishop Canterbury. And we want to thank all of you for watching the show. We really appreciate it. So we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been a production of the Gnostic Wisdom Network. For more information about this and all of GWN's programming, please visit gnosticwisdom.net. The opinions expressed in this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of GWN, the Apostolic Johannite Church, or any other organization. This has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International License and is brought to you by the generous support of our patrons. To support our programs and become a patron, please visit patreon.com/Gnostic. That's patreon.com/GNOSTIC.